This video was brought to you by this comment. Okay, so what's going to happen is Operation Scarlet Sphere is coming very, very soon. It might not be coming this week because DE is trying to transition to working from home, which will probably take at least a couple of days. So I'm not really expecting it this week, but if it does come this week before the weekend, that would be fantastic, so we'll just see. But in the meantime, what you're going to really want to make sure is that your Railjack is up to scratch. There are a couple of things that you should be doing already in time for Scarlet Spear, depending on when Scarlet Spear decides to drop. Otherwise, everything else should be pretty much something that you can do over a few days. So let's get into it. The first thing you want to do is you want to build your Railjack. How are we going to do that? Well, we're literally going to be completing a quest called the Rising Tide quest. Now, keep in mind that the Rising Tide quest, for those who haven't actually started it yet, has been made a lot easier in the sense that you don't need as many resources now to build your Railjack, and you don't need to spend as much time just sitting there and waiting for your Railjack. It used to take 12 hours to build each part of the Railjack in your dojo. Now it only takes 6, so that's really, really good. And also you only need 10-ish, 20-ish Railjack resources per round, as well as a bunch of other resources that you can find just readily available throughout the star chart. So if you want to get those Railjack resources, I actually would recommend going on a Railjack mission with just anyone, and any old Railjack mission will reward you with at least hundreds of those resources, no problem. The alternative, of course, being to actually mine them, for example, in the Plains of Eidolon, I don't think is all that efficient. Also, if you join a Railjack mission, you might also be able to get some Intrinsics. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this, but you probably don't need a Railjack to start getting Intrinsics. Don't quote me on that though, because I don't know for a fact, okay? Now, the next thing that you'll want to do is to complete the star chart. Now, of course, I'm not referring to the star chart that is available from the orbiter. I am, of course, referring to the star chart that you can find from this good old-fashioned navigation console in the Railjack. This is the star chart for Railjack. We have Earth, Saturn, and Vale Proximas, so they're not the planets, because we are in space. It seems like the Earth Proxima has the most amount of missions, but they do cover the smallest amount of space per mission. Does that make sense? Basically, in order to get from the starting area to the final, usually final area with rocks and stuff, the Earth Proxima is very, very short, and that's because at level 1, your Mark 1 engines are not particularly fast, so it's going to feel like it's taking just as long. But the idea is that when you get to the Vale Proxima, which is this one right here, where it's all red and green space depending on which mission you're at, you should have some very useful parts. So what would be some of the parts that I am calling very, very useful? Well, obviously the first one is the reactor. When you receive a Mark III reactor, you will get a lot of extra avionics capacity, and the avionics capacity is very, very useful in allowing you to use more avionics. So, for example, here I have an entire avionics array full to the brim with different avionics. Some are integrated, some are tactical avionics, and some are battle avionics, and they are all very useful in their own special way. Fantastic. In order to get a lot of avionics capacity, you're going to need a really strong reactor. Obviously, the reactor that you should be aiming for is the Vidar Reactor Mark III. The Vidar reactors can give you between 90 and 100 extra avionics capacity, which is very, very strong. Whether or not Scarlet Spear or any future Railjack missions will give you reactors that have even more avionics capacity, that remains to be seen. Here's the thing. It used to be that if you don't get a Vidar Reactor Mark III, you're basically screwed. That is no longer the case anymore. So do not worry. If you don't get a Vidar Reactor Mark III, you will still be fine. If you get yourself a Lavan Reactor Mark III that has between 80 and 90 avionics capacity bonus, then you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be a little bit better in the way that you'll have way more flux capacity, so that's really, really good. Or alternatively, you could get the most common of the reactors, which is of course the Zetki Reactor Mark III, which will give you more flux capacity, and it will give you somewhere between 70 and 80 avionics capacity. 70 and 80 avionics capacity is actually not a bad thing. you can still manage quite relatively easily with that. Sure, you won't be able to probably fill your entire Avionics grid with all of the best things, but real talk, you can't really do that with a Vidar Reactor Mark III either. If you want to use stuff like the Z-Key Bulkhead and the Z-Key Hyper Strike at the same time, those are extremely heavy avionics, which means that you won't really be able to fit them anyway. Basically, it's really easy to make do with a Z-Key Reactor Mark III. I did a deep dive on Railjack when the RNG just bloody hates you and you're left with only a Z-Key Reactor Mark III. You will be fine. That's the idea. So don't worry, you don't need to build a Sigma Reactor Mark III to be better than a Z-Key Reactor Mark III. In fact, I would probably recommend not worrying about any of the Sigma parts outside of ordinances and all of that jazz. The next part that you want to keep an eye out for is your engines, and the Vidar engines, specifically the Vidar engines Mark III, is the one that you really want to be aiming for. There is a bit of a difference between the Vidar engines and the Lavin engines and the Z-Key engines, in that the Vidar engines are able to give you a lot more speed overall, whilst even though the Lavin and the Z-Key engines will give you more boost, that does not usually translate to more speed overall. So I would highly recommend sticking to using the Vidar engines. They are the fastest. If you don't get a Vidar engine, that's fine. Any Mark III engine will be alright for the time being. But again, the point is you really want to be aiming for the Vidar engines because they will give you the most speed in general. Now, the next part that I would highly recommend you look out for is a Mark III Cochrans. It does not necessarily have to be a Lavin or a Vidar Cochrans as I am using right here, but I would recommend these two types of Cochrans. Now, the Lavin Cochrans typically has more status chance, whilst the Vidar Cochrans typically has more damage. Now, the reason why I highly recommend the Cochrans as opposed to any of the other guns is because first off, it has really high fire rate, and secondly, it has really good procs, specifically the plasma proc. Now, the plasma status effect is essentially the armor removing status effect. It is capable of removing armor from all fighters and all cruise ships, which is really, really powerful, especially when you want to use a forward artillery against a cruise ship. Now, of course, these days you don't necessarily need to use a Cochrans anymore. Just strip the armor of a cruise ship to one-shot it with a forward artillery shot. You can actually just shoot the engines and you will be fine. But on the off chance that, for example, the cruise ship is really, really far away and you can't aim at the engines, you want to have a weapon attached to at least the pilot gun, in my opinion, so that you can fire at the cruise ship in question and then you can actually just blow it up without having to aim specifically for those engines. Alternatives include the APOC. The APOC does actually fit the same kind of role as well, so if you get yourself an APOC Mark III, for example a Z-Key APOC Mark III, you should be fine, but keep in mind they do have a lot less status chance, so it's entirely possible that they are a little bit worse in that regard. Otherwise, all the other weapons are pretty good, except for maybe the Cryofin. The Cryofin is more of just a straight damage weapon, so really think about whether or not you want to use that. The other weapon that you want to get is obviously just any other Mark III for your gunner. I would highly recommend not equipping your ship with 2 Cryofins. I have been in a ship with 2 Cryofins. It was a bit of a snooze fest when you have a ship with 2 Cryofins, so definitely don't recommend that. Instead, having maybe a Cochrans and a Photor, for example, or a Cochrans and an APOC, a Cochrans and a Pulsar, a Cochrans and a Cryofin. You know, just some nice combination of these weapons will be the best idea. The next thing you want to get is any Mark III ordnance, and in order to get them, you just basically have to research them. There are no Z-Key Mark III Tycho Seekers or Milati dumbfire rockets. Instead, they are all Sigma weapons as far as I can tell. Keep in mind, I have never seen, and it doesn't seem to exist in the wiki either, I have never seen any Z-Key types or any of that jazz. So as far as I can tell, they're all research-based weapons. So by researching them, you get to immediately use them, which is really, really good. I personally prefer the Tycho Seeker Mark III because I find it is the most useful, but I may start to actually try and use the Milati for a change. I have used it before, I didn't really like it, but maybe with certain scenarios and certain combinations, the Milati might actually be a little bit better. So, pending further assessment of the other two ordinances, being the Milati and the Galvark, I would recommend the Tycho Seeker Mark III. Alright, let's talk builds. So I've already shown you my Avionics grid that is just full to the brim with bits and bobs that are really, really useful. There are some things that I personally would recommend that you use. So the first thing, of course, is Conic Nozzle and Ion Burn. These are speed avionics, and I personally prefer speed above all else, simply because I have been on ships that prefer tankiness above all else. They bore me massively, they actually make me fall asleep, so I prefer not to be on those ships if you ask me. But if you prefer to have a ship that is just so tanky that nothing phases you, okay, that's fine, that is totally your prerogative, in which case you're going to be looking around for something called the Z-Key Bulkhead, which can be found on Earth, and the Z-Key Hyperstrike, which allegedly can be found on Earth, but I'm not 100% sure about that. The next avionics that you'll really want to look for are your tactical avionics. So your tactical avionics like Flow Burn, Void Cloaks, Fire Suppression, I find these to be the most useful of them all. If you don't have space to put in Flow Burn, because yes, it is a very heavy avionic, then you could decide to use something such as Intruder Stasis. With the amount of hype surrounding supposedly sentient ram sleds, I get the feeling that Intruder Stasis is going to be extremely useful in this operation. It's also very useful in general if you're having a hard time dealing with those ram sleds, because they can be very annoying, and if you find yourself in a situation where you're surrounded by cruise ships and you have, say, an objective nearby, you might potentially end up with at least 3 ram sleds and therefore 3 boarding parties in your ship, with another 2 just about ready to show up at any given point in time. So I definitely recommend Intruder Stasis. Again, I wish Intruder Stasis worked like Stasis for Limbo, in that it was a duration-based stasis that would freeze any other incoming boarding parties. Right now it only freezes those who are currently in your ship. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Otherwise, I don't know, play around. Just figure out what you want to use. Death Blossom battle stations are also useful as well. All of them are useful in some way, shape or form, except potentially Squad Renewal, because Form Up exists, or vice versa. The next avionics that you'll really want to be getting are battle avionics, because a ship without battle avionics is also a bit of a snooze fest. So we'll first start off with defensive battle avionics. If you can get yourself a munitions vortex, that would probably be the way to go. Munitions vortex is extremely powerful, although I think you can only get it from the Veil, so you're going to have to be farming Railjack for that. But it is really, really good at wiping out a ton of enemies, so that's really, really good. Blackout Pulse is something that I would probably avoid. Again, I don't really see much of a reason to use this, especially with its 8 avionics capacity drain. Otherwise, there is always countermeasures, which I like to use more simply because it is something that's nice and actually defensive for a change. I don't really need to double down on my offensiveness when I already have something like Tether and Seeker Volley, or Particle Ram and Void Hole, or Shadowburst, or something like that. When it comes to your offensive battle avionics, they're all good. Tether is pretty good, especially with the Tether fix, quote unquote, where you can now actually grab up to 10 enemy fighters. I do sometimes see that even though there's like 12 fighters on the screen, sometimes with Tether still only grabs like 6 or 8 of them, or 9 of them, but at least it is doing what appears to be doing its job now, so that's really, really good. Otherwise, Particle Ram is always a good choice, and Particle Ram can actually be acquired from Earth. It's really, really easy to get it, so if you don't have Particle Ram somehow by the time you get to Veil, something has gone horribly wrong. Otherwise, Shadowburst is pretty good. It now actually shows the amount of damage that is being done, so I will have to continue studying it before I can make a final assessment of it, but for the time being, it seems to be pretty good, and it still works really well when coupled with something like Void Hole. And finally, your Super Avionics, and there's only really two choices worth thinking about, and that is Void Hole and Seeker Volley. Seeker Volley, with the enemy armor nerfs that came about start of this year, Seeker Volley does perform a little better. I wouldn't say a lot better. I don't think it's performing as good as it needs to be, but that being said, if you pair it with something like Tether, you can actually get quite a lot of damage out of your Seeker Volley when those enemies are come together. I do find that Seeker Volley sometimes can be a lot more useful than Void Hole when enemies are spread out, so that is probably going to be something that you're going to be coming across in the Railjack in the operation, so you really want to keep an eye on that. Otherwise, there's always Void Hole. You can't go wrong with Void Hole. For the most part, it is always very useful, but it is extremely rare. So Seeker Volley is not particularly rare. You should be able to have it by the time you reach the Veil. I think it drops from Earth missions and possibly other missions as well in other Proximas. Don't quote me on that. I have seen it show up in the Veil, I think, so I'm not 100% sure about that. But if you can't get the Void Hole, you should be okay with at least Seeker Volley for the time being. Just keep in mind that you're going to be using quite a lot more energy if you're going to be relying on Seeker Volley as opposed to Void Hole, because Void Hole is typically a lot more efficient at destroying a lot of enemies. So after you have all of your avionics sorted out, the next thing you're going to want to make sure that you have sorted out is your intrinsics. Now, as long as you continue to do Railjack missions, you will be getting intrinsics. That's the way the game works. Until, of course, you reach 10-10-10, in which case, why are you even watching this video? Your Railjack should be perfectly fine. When it comes to intrinsics, it's your intrinsics that matter, not theirs. So basically what that means is that your intrinsics will carry over to whatever ship that you're on, even if it's not your own ship. Even if the owner, for example, doesn't have access to his own artillery cannon, you do if you have level 5 gunnery. So that's something that you may want to look into. Otherwise, there's really only one intrinsic that I would highly recommend and sort of label as mandatory / important, and that is rank 4 tactical, because rank 4 tactical is recall warp. Recall warp allows you to warp back to your ship at any given point in time. So if you decide to go into the outpost / something rather ship that's going to be showing up in the operation, then you can then recall back to your ship if, for example, the ship is suddenly overrun with Sentience because it got rammed by a bunch of ram sleds. So that, I think, is really important and extremely useful. Otherwise, every other one is more or less up to personal preference, and if you really want to go hardcore into, say, tactical rank 10, which I have, then that's obviously your personal preference. For me, personally, I went for 8888 and then went for rank 10 tacticals, so that's kind of the even spread that I would go for. And finally, I would probably recommend practicing against Sentience. So, for example, here we have some Sentience here. There are a couple of things you may want to use, for example, the Paracesis, because the Paracesis is really good at basically getting rid of the sentient adaptation bonuses with every swipe. That is actually its passive capability, so that's really good. And also it is capable of using the 2 sacrificial mods really easily, because it is a rank 40 weapon, so that means it's pretty damn strong at dealing with all of that stuff. Alternatively, you could try and use the Shedu, because that weapon also gets rid of the sentient adaptation bonuses that they could have. Or alternatively, you could try and kit out your kiddo to be really powerful. I am actually using a very strange weapon right now, but for amp recommendations, you're going to have to look around for someone else. Of course, you could be as powerful as the 5000 IQ Platinum Arrow, in which case you don't really need to worry about using something like the Paracesis or the Shedu. You could just overpower them with the might of Mag herself, because Mag is extremely strong. There are a couple of things that I can do to deal with it. For example, I can make use of shield gating, so that's going to make me survive. I can also stun them with things like counterpulse. I can also stick them in a magnetized bubble as per usual, so that's really good. Just keep in mind that with Battleists specifically, when they die, they do release an explosion, and that explosion can kill you if they are level 100. They tend to be really strong. It's unclear what level the Sentients are going to be in Operation Scarlet Spear, but since they are going to be a series of endless missions, i.e. reverse excavation, which is basically an endless mission, and I think the space one is also an endless mission as well, you could probably expect them to start off at level 30, which is a pretty normal level, and then ramp up at some point to level 100, and then moving forward, maybe level 120, 130, 140. If they can ramp up a lot faster, that'd be nice. I do want to actually face that kind of challenge. So that's basically everything I reckon that you'll really need to keep an eye on before Scarlet Sphere shows up. Again, you'll want to build your Railjack, you'll want to complete the Railjack star chart, you'll want to find and grind some really special parts like reactors and engines in particular. You'll want to make sure that you have some good avionics, particularly battle and tactical avionics, because I think they're going to play a much more important role. And you'll want to get your intrinsics sorted out so that you can at least do something with your ship, preferably fire most of its weapons and maybe board some ships and also be able to recall back to your ship as well. And in the end, you'll really want to be practicing against Sentience. So let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. Do you think you'll be ready for Operation Scarlet Spear when it shows up? Let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about your Railjack and any just general Railjack things, feel free to hit me up in the comments. That's what they're there for. You probably won't find any of that kind of help from your more meta WarFrame YouTubers. But until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more WarFrame content. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye. Oh, for those who are wondering, I have the power!